Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It feels like a timely moment to be discussing the long journey of British feminism, what with the men's football on right now. If you have your phone on silent, no one will say anything. You'll notice, though, that news organisations still talk about the England team as opposed to the England women's team. Susanna's book takes us back through time and forward again to now, from a time when women were the property of their husbands, had no rights to their own children, could not vote, had to leave jobs on marriage, the fear and the stigma of unmarried pregnancy and divorce, when politicians and the news media mocked women for challenging discrimination and bias. Plus ça change. Susanna Rustin, I want to read this blurb on the back of her book. I love Rustin's attitude, unafraid to ask all kinds of questions with a calm, inquiring mind. How did we get here? Who says feminism comes in waves? A fascinating, illuminating, and essential history of British feminism written in the eye of the hurricane around sex and gender raging right now by Samira Ahmed. Welcome, Susanna Rustin.
Thank you very much.
So the plan is Susanna and I are going to talk about her book in 20 minutes, and then I've got an amazing panel of women who've been part of the story of British feminism and are still very much part of it, to share their unique insights on their roles in the story that's in the book, really. And then we've got 20 minutes for Q&A, so think about what you'd like to ask. So I wanted to start, Susanna, with saying where, or rather when in time, did you decide to start this history of British feminism, and why?
So when I started thinking about it, I thought it was going to be a book about the last 100 years, the 100 years since the suffrage movement. Obviously, we're in between the centenary of the 1918 Women's Suffrage Act and the 1928 one. So I thought of it as a sort of 100 years, mainly because I knew more about the 20th century than I do about the 19th century, and felt, as a journalist, sort of more confident, comfortable with the recent past. And it was, in fact, one of my publisher, Polity, sent the proposal out to some readers for sort of comments and recommendations. And it was one of the readers that said, are you sure this shouldn't go back a bit further? And there was already going to be some 19th century material in there, because if you write about the suffrage movement, then you obviously have to go back to the 19th century, because that's when it started. So I already had sort of one foot back into the mid-19th century. And then actually I'm so delighted that I had that suggestion, because although it seemed a bit sort of hackneyed and obvious to start with Mary Wollstonecraft, actually she so pays rereading, and I've found it really rich experience, actually, to go back and think about her a bit more. A few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to do an event in Stoke Newington, in the Newington Green Chapel, where she lived and where she worked for a time. And so in a way, well, I'm really pleased it worked out like that. But Mary Wollstonecraft is a kind of obvious place to start. So in the end, I sort of started in the obvious place.
Let's not talk about that statue. So early on in the book, which is really interesting, there is this fundamental philosophical disagreement that emerges between all these philosophers, male and female, about feminism, on how far the sexed body matters. Should feminists move beyond being seen as females? Tell me about how that was playing out in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, and indeed beyond that.
So Mary Wollstonecraft has a really quite complicated and sort of subtle view, and obviously also one that changes over her lifetime. Her views in the 1790s in the Vindication of the Rights of Women do move on to some of her later books. There's never any attempt to sort of deny sexual difference. That's a really a modern phenomenon. Into the 19th century, even the liberals like John Stuart Mill, who really do want to minimise sex differences and say they're really not very important politically, they quite often, there's often a yes but to those kinds of sentiments. But they'll say, oh, but actually, in some circumstances, for example, he speaks in the House of Commons about domestic violence. So there's always this kind of tension between arguing that women are equal and entitled to rights, political rights, and legal rights, but also an acknowledgement of sort of women's bodies and the distinct life experiences, particularly, most obviously, motherhood, that gives rise to.
One of the really interesting facts I got from this book is that radical Unitarian circle, so kind of church group, proved very important in the 19th century to feminism. They were among the first to omit the vow to obey in wedding vows. Tell me about that.
So that's the milieu that Mary Wollstonecraft moved in. Although she was an Anglican herself, that was one of the sort of radical circles in the 1790s, and other nonconformists. So Unitarians were one group, Quakers, obviously another. Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer, is another sort of fascinating figure, not a sort of feminist in a straightforward way, but absolutely a role model for a woman having a sort of public life and a religious life. She's a very important religious figure, but also sort of guiltily, she actually thought she liked wine and dancing too much. So, yeah, I mean, I think just like, as in lots of 19th century social movements, famously Edward Thompson, nonconformist religion is a hugely important part of the whole development of the democratic movement, working class politics, but also feminist politics.
We'll talk more about class specifically, but I'm interested, I was thinking Anne Bronte, who I wrote my undergraduate thesis on. I wrote about the politics of marriage in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And of course, she was a Christian socialist, essentially, and very much saw women's rights as something that was sort of spiritually sanctioned too, which I thought was very interesting. Right, another thing that jumped out at me from the book, the Contagious Diseases Act proves an important moment of focus for Victorian feminists. How?
So the campaign that was led by Josephine Butler from the 1860s onwards against the Contagious Diseases Act is just a crucial moment. So they're not the first sort of women-only campaign groups. There is prison reform groups connected with Elizabeth Fry, and actually there are also some women-only anti-slavery groups. But the Ladies' National Association, which is set up to campaign against the Contagious Diseases Act, which are laws passed in the 1860s, which enable the police to conduct compulsory genital inspections of prostitutes or women that they think they are prostitutes to try and limit the spread of venereal disease, initially in port and garrison towns, because they're worried about soldiers, but they explicitly say that they won't be inspecting soldiers because they're worried about the impact on morale. So the prostitutes and sort of suspected prostitutes are sort of subjected to this extremely repressive sort of surveillance regime. And Josephine Butler is comes from this kind of same sort of liberal reforming background as some of the women I've already mentioned. Just becomes the sort of figurehead, sort of glamorous and charismatic figurehead of this campaign. She's a head teacher's wife. She and her husband both know that it's not going to do his career any good at all for her to take on this issue, but she absolutely plunges into it, and it's very dramatic and brave. They've have sort of violent attacks on their meetings quite often, including arson. She sort of is escaping in the middle of the night. And it's a very sort of
men smashing windows where women are meeting inside. Yeah.
So it's a sort of really important staging post for the idea of autonomous women's organising, but also for a kind of really direct and radical sort of confrontation with a patriarchal state. I don't think they use that phrase, but they're really clear that they're fighting against kind of male authority and abusive male authority. As women.
So interesting as well, middle-class women campaigning on an issue which obviously affects very poor, vulnerable women around the sex trade, an issue which was considered then, even more than now, an issue that women should somehow not be talking about, even though it affected them. I think that's very interesting how the sex trade is so often linked very closely to feminist activism from the start.
Yeah, I mean, this becomes some leads to quite complicated relations, obviously, with women who are quite rich, privileged, well-off, and then prostitutes who are, extremely vulnerable. And there is this tradition of rescue work, which has a benign aspect. You know, there are sort of refuges and places of protection, but I think there are also, like, not every prostitute wanted to be rescued in quite the way that these well-meaning women proposed. So there is obviously some tension around whose interests are being served and, you know, the kind of Lady Bountiful kind of rescue mission. But I think Josephine Butler is a really admirable figure, and, you know, they did run these rescue houses, and I think a lot of women were helped and protected from a really abusive and exploitative, demoralizing, unsafe way of life.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting, she's a really interesting figure that you pick out in the book, so I'm glad she gets a bit of a moment in the spotlight. Now, we're going to talk more about politics with our panel too, but we are speaking, of course, just after the election of a new government. I have to say, I found it especially moving watching Diane Abbott being welcomed as Mother of the House, given her battles. But also, reading your book made me appreciate anew the very, very long battle for the vote. And not just for the vote, but for women to actually secure seats so they could represent people in Parliament. What did you learn about, through researching this book, about the kind of political journey of British feminism in legislative process?
So I think I really didn't know very much when I started. The 1920s is sort of fascinating because the first women MPs, who obviously include Nancy Astor and the nationalist Constance Markievicz, who doesn't ever come to the House of Commons, who's the first woman elected, they get these huge post bags, and they do sort of see themselves, I think, as the sort of MPs for women as well as their constituencies. And there's just a small group of them, Tories, Liberals and Labour through the 1920s. It's been interesting in the last few days hearing Harriet Harman talk about the need for a sort of women's caucus, which obviously now would be hundreds of women, but you know, they were a sort of group and they did work together on some things. Then sort of more women get elected, and then they go back to 5 in the 1930s, just before the war. There's only 5 MPs, and it's still incredibly low when Harriet Harman and Diane Abbott get elected in the 80s. You know, I can't remember the exact figures, but it's a really small percentage. So there's a huge, but the women's liberation movement is not particularly invested in the issue of political representation. It's never one of their sort of aims to sort of increase the number of women MPs. That's become really prominent. Obviously, there are groups like 50-50 Parliament and Fawcett who talk about that a lot. But it's quite interesting that, you know, sometimes it absolutely feels like the most urgent thing to get women into Parliament. But in the 70s, it wasn't seen as the kind of the way of necessarily advancing the aims of the women's liberation.
Yeah, no, that's one of the issues I found really fascinating, for the way that you look at the numbers. And there's also this very interesting push for legislation by some of these women MPs focused on improving the situation for mothers and children, so making sure that benefits are paid to mothers and not to the husband. And then equally there are those MPs, including I think some female MPs, who feel that such an approach makes women appear weak. I'm interested in this dichotomy and how important it is to the feminist battles that were emerging through those middle decades of the century.
So one of the things I did know about sort of before I started writing, because I was interested in Winifred Holtby, who's a writer and actually a really astute feminist thinker, I think, was this argument that took place in the 20s. I think it was really after the suffrage movement, because although the suffragists were very divided around strategy, and not only strategy, but they had lots of divisions, but they did have a shared goal, which was votes for women. And then once that is in sight, there's then a kind of question about, so what next? And I think that's when the word feminist really rises up and becomes, because before that they can be suffragists. And then there's a kind of series of discussions which do predate the suffrage acts, but in the 20s they become very sort of live debates and really arguments about what the priorities for the women's groups should be. And I think what Samira's alluding to specifically is the sort of division that arises between a group of feminists who call themselves old feminists, who are sort of really wanting to stick to the issue of equality with men, and they think, okay, so now we've got rid of the bar on voting, we've got rid of the bar on the professions, which happens in 1919, so that women are allowed to train as lawyers and doctors. And then they want to just sort of equalise, or there's a big fight that goes on until the 1950s to get women allowed to sit in the House of Lords. It's not till 1958 that finally happens, and there's a prominent suffragette whose sort of life's work it is to try and inherit her father's seat in the House of Lords, and she failed. So that's one sort of camp. And then the other camp, which is led by one of my heroes, Eleanor Rathbone, who did lots of work giving out sort of benefits to servicemen's wives during the First World War in Liverpool, and was really dismayed and shocked by the levels of poverty that she saw. So sort of family poverty becomes her sort of issue, and she really spends 20 years campaigning for what were called family allowances when they were introduced with the welfare state in 1946, and then were subsequently turned into child benefit. But really, there's a real battle to ensure that those benefits are paid to mothers, not fathers, because they are both to reduce poverty and support particularly larger families because they're per child, but also to give women some financial independence. So it's not only about poverty, it's also about women's financial independence and making women less dependent on sort of single breadwinner. So, but that is obviously sort of specifically around sort of mothers' needs, and some of the women that were more focused on equal rights didn't really support this particular agenda around, which seemed to sort of emphasise the differences between men and women.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Can I ask a bit about the battles over pornography? It feels like the 80s and the 90s are when the fight against that really gets going. But equally, it's the era when I remember the press starting to talk about so-called post-feminism. What was going on in your assessment?
So I find it kind of complicated thinking about that period, because I think there are sort of different things going on at once. I mean, I think Natasha Walter's book, I think she and some other writers... Living Dolls. There were some other writers who were, I think, quite much more alert than I was at the time to this kind of, sort of pornification of kind of consumer culture, which, Natasha sort of links it to the kind of genderification as well, so that the kind of pink and blue for children relates to this kind of hypersexualized kind of imagery that sort of suddenly seems to be everywhere. Obviously the sort of lad mags, that whole sort of culture. And then, sorry, what was the other bit of the question?
People started to talk in the press about so-called post-feminism, which sounds to be like the start of something which is still with us today, which is the sort of academic kind of gender politics of things.
Yeah, I think part of me thinks in the academy people maybe just got a bit bored and wanted to move on, and sort of gender felt like a sort of newer thing and a new set of ideas. Obviously, some of the big battles had been won. I think, there weren't sort of obvious legislative barriers in the same way. So inequality just became quite sort of diffuse, I think, and people had really different ideas about how to sort of pursue it. I mean, I think in that period, just spotting Harriet, that the feminist criminal justice movement was really important. And that was something that carried on through the sort of New Labour years, the kind of recognition of the sort of structural disadvantage for women in sort of policing and the courts, prisons as well. So I think that was an interesting sort of British thing that happened here, which that I wrote about. But I guess I feel like it was my chapter about the 90s and the noughties is kind of divided into sections, and I suppose it is a period when I feel like there were different things going on that didn't necessarily sort of join up that neatly.
Yeah. You look at some key landmark moments of feminist activism, like the Greenham Common protests, the Reclaim the Night marches that were sparked in response to the Yorkshire Ripper murders. Do any of these things, do you feel, sort of change things fundamentally, or are they more about women coming together as grassroots activists?
I mean, I think that women coming together as activists does change things because it's part of political culture. So if you're interested in the kind of idea of autonomous women's political organising, then all these things, of course, are part of that history. I think sort of whether specific sort of actions and campaigns sort of make a lasting difference is often a hard question to answer. I mean, I think on the violence against women front, it's really hard to say that, you know, Reclaim the Night worked, because things are awful. But having said that, you know, it doesn't mean that it was all a waste of time, because it's partly about sort of consciousness raising and finding ways to ways to express and be active around those issues.
You also talk in the book about this idea of, you know, waves of feminism. I'm really interested that you challenge that. Tell me why.
So I think I was partly, well, I was unsure, actually. I just wasn't really sure what it all sort of added up to. And definitely sort of since the second wave, I was clear on the sort of first wave, okay, although it all seemed to be a bit like suffrage and then all this other stuff. And then the second wave was obviously clear. And then after that, sort of third, fourth, I think we had pieces in The Guardian about maybe fifth, even sixth. And I certainly sort of wasn't sort of really clear about that. Just seemed to be more about sort of media framing, really, or, you know, than about anything that could really be defined as a kind of movement. And then obviously there's also a question about, you know, Britain and America, the rest of the world, you know, because I think British feminism has often been sort of bundled up with American feminism. And obviously there are lots of influences back and forth, and that's important and valuable to be aware of. But I guess I'm sort of, you know, a bit kind of uncomfortable. I had questions about whether, you know, is the second wave a global phenomenon? Is it an Anglo-American phenomenon? Is it a Western phenomenon? And just wanting to be a bit more sort of precise, really, about what we're really talking about when we talk about these waves.
Yeah. And my last question before I bring up the panel is, you end the book looking at the row over gender and trans activism. How did you decide to write about this? And what lessons are there, given where we are at this point in history? There's a lot still to be sorted, I think it's fair to say.
That's definitely fair to say. So I guess, I mean, I knew that feminists didn't talk about gender until the 70s, really. Although I did discover that Winifred Holtby recommended that feminists should stop talking about sex and talk about gender in a book she wrote in 1932, which I was astonished by, and basically for reasons that really are reminiscent of the reasons that much more recently I think feminists don't like talking about sex, because it has this kind of biological baggage that people are uncomfortable with, and that's exactly what Winifred Holtby thought about it. But obviously in the context of this sort of sex-based rights versus gender identity-based rights, there's a kind of challenge to whether it's kind of legitimate to talk about sex-based rights or sex at all. And since I knew that nobody talked about gender until 50 years ago, I sort of thought surely it's worth trying to sort of excavate not just the vocabulary, but also the ideas that women did have before that. Because I sort of thought otherwise you're sort of cutting yourself off at the knees. If you think of feminism as a sort of political philosophy, you know, with a tradition going back to the 1790s at least, which I definitely did, I sort of thought, how can it be that the vocabulary that's acceptable now is a vocabulary that's only really existed for a few decades? That just couldn't be right, and I thought it would be useful to sort of find out what if that was right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, well, I always think unless we understand our history, we can't understand where we are and where we're going. So thank you. Let me welcome our panel now to sort of widen the conversation around this discussion of British feminism. And we're going to reflect on the past few decades and look ahead as well. So please welcome, I'll introduce them one by one, come up as I introduce you. Sally Alexander, feminist historian, emerita professor of modern history at the University of London, founding editor of the History Workshop Journal. Welcome. Sit wherever you like. We're also being joined by Tonia Antoniazzi. She's the Labour MP for Gower. And Tonia's been an MP continually since June 2017. Our next panellist is Jane Clare Jones. academic, philosopher, founder of the Centre for Feminist Thought and editor of the feminist journal Radical Notion. Pragna Patel. Pragna is a feminist activist and the current director of Project Resist, a new initiative campaigning for the rights of black and minoritized women. She's the former director and a founding member of the Southall Black Sisters and a member of feminist dissent. And our final panelist is Victoria Smith. Victoria is most recently the author of the wonderful book, Hags, The Demonization of Middle-Aged Women. Another brilliant book. Right, I've got a couple of questions for each of you, and then we've got some general discussion points and then audience questions. So, Pragna first. Yeah, no pressure. Oh yeah, and you can turn the mics on with that thing.
Hello.
You just turn it on when you're speaking.
Hello.
It's best. Unless you all want to dissent at the same time over each other. Part of what Susanna's book does is a look at the whole dilemma of so-called intersectionality and how, minoritized women, disabled women, lesbian women, there's sometimes, if not conflicts, there are different issues that emerge. And I wondered if you could just tell me a bit about looking back on what needs Southall Black Sisters was filling that others weren't. It was 79, is that right?
79, yeah. Well, I think that 1979 was a period of intense anti-racist activity. We were seeing second generations of Asians, African Caribbeans, and others, largely men in minority communities rising up against racial violence, police brutality, far-right violence. And so it was a really, really important period. It was also the rise of Thatcherism and the kind of social divisions that were created, the neoliberal economy that was being consolidated. So that there was a churning. It was a really important moment.
A lot more of the civic state then to support people. And so
Absolutely.
You found that there was a specific set of needs that no one else was meeting, wasn't there?
So Southall Black Sisters came out of, we were a child of Thatcherism, a child of the anti-racist mobilizations that were going on. But what we found, why did we need to organize autonomously as black women? And I want to come back to this idea of black, which was very much a political term, but is now very much rejected as a mobilizing term, which we had adopted because we felt that as black and minority women, as sort of Asian women, African Caribbean women, women from minorities, we felt very much that we needed our own political home. We felt that the anti-racist movement had failed to deal with the question of women, question of women's oppression.
Violence.
Not just violence, but generally, the women were just invisible. Women's issues were invisible, yes, and particularly violence in the home and so on. And then the burgeoning, if you want to call it second wave feminism, but the wider feminist movement was devoid of any question of race. And so black women, and SBS wasn't the only one. I mean, there were groups like Brixton Black Women's Group, and there were others, came together for a very short time, didn't last long, as a movement to challenge race, sex, and class oppression at one and the same time. It wasn't known as intersectionality in those days. That's a fashionable term that's been coined. It was coined by Crenshaw, and been used since, Kimberly Crenshaw, and has been used since, and I would say it's been misused. But we were doing and thinking intersectional oppression from the 70s onwards. So, for us, it was really important to... The other thing I just want to say is it was really important to build on some of the most amazing struggles that were taking place that were led by women, particularly African Caribbean women against police brutality and institutionalized racism, and Asian women on the picket lines challenging Grunwick's as an example, Imperial typewriter struggle, another one. And the reason I mention them is because what they tell us now is how important those struggles were as secular struggles, in which religion played no part.
Yeah.
You know?
We'll come back
and I want to come back to that question of religious oppression.
Thank you, Pragna. Sally, as a historian, as an academic, I'm wondering how you look at the way feminist theory, ideas around feminism and activism kind of related to each other, and how your view of this has changed over time. And when you began in the 70s, feminist academics and academia probably look quite different to how it does now.
Well,
hold it up closer to you if you can.
Sorry, is that okay?
Yep.
So, in the late 60s, 1970s, when the women's liberation movement first started, very few of us were feminist, were academic. You know, like of my generation, only 6% of the population went to university in the early 60s, and a very small percentage of those were women. Most of us had left school at 15 or 16 at the most in the early 60s, late 50s. So by the end of the 1960s, I was myself an undergraduate. And so academic feminism was just non-existent. I know it seems extraordinary now, but the ideas came from consciousness raising, from political activism, from all sorts of campaigns around women's work, women's employment, violence against women, women's refuges, women's law centers, you know, all sorts of campaigns. And those are where the ideas came from, and from study groups. And to use the term, Pragna said how black was a political term in the late 70s. Well, in the late 60s, early 70s, woman was a political term. And it was everywhere that you looked, in legislation or popular culture or in, you know, textbooks on social policy and so on. Women were buried in the family. So to use the word woman, women's liberation, it couldn't be said often enough. So that was a political term too, and that has obviously changed in many ways.
It's interesting as well. Something Julie Bindel often talks about is the difference between talking about women's equality and women's liberation. It's such an amazing, powerful and important word, which is still, I think, not used enough when people talk about feminism today. I have to ask, because they made a film linked to the Miss World protest in 1970 that you played a big part in, and you are the only person on the panel to have been portrayed by Keira Knightley in the film Misbehaviour. Can I ask how it felt to have that activism celebrated on film for a modern audience, including a lot of young people who would have had no idea of just what was normalised behaviour for women in the 70s?
Well, you should ask my granddaughter, who's sitting here. And she's the same age I was when the women's liberation movement started in the late 1960s, in her mid-20s. There are two ways to answer that. I mean, one is that it was wonderful that the film was made, and most of the activists and so on who were involved in the making of the film were really pleased with it. And Rebecca Frayne wrote a wonderful script, and Philippa Lloyd directed it marvelously, and I particularly liked the way she opened the film, for those of you who've seen it, with flashes of the anti-apartheid movement, gay liberation, anti-Vietnam, you know, labor movement struggles, and so on. In other words, women's liberation came out of a kind of melee of political movements and radical movements of the 60s, in the wake of 68, of course. Oh, you shouldn't ask me how I like watching. I hated the film. Oh, I couldn't bear it. I promised the producers that I wouldn't say that. I was told,
you need to share with the group, I think.
They changed the story, and I would never have demonstrated if I'd known what they showed me as knowing in the film, because I had a 4-year-old daughter, and I would never have risked anything happening to her. However, people love it, and what can I say? I mean, it took a long time in the making. They really nurtured the producer of the film, and the writer and the director really nurtured it for years, and it was Keira Knightley who got the money. Yeah. So when Keira Knightley came on, she raised the money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Jane. Jane, you also have an academic background, and you wrote a PhD on the issue of rape,
yes,
but ultimately decided to work outside of universities. Can you tell me a bit about both those decisions, the PhD, what you found then, and why you've not gone into an academic career where you are working in feminism now?
I mean, I think there's quite a few reasons why I didn't go into an academic career. Part of it was because I wanted to be in the women's liberation movement. And part of it was that I felt like I had a kind of responsibility to use the understanding that I had developed through my studies to communicate that to other women. And also partly because by the time I'd finished my PhD, it wasn't really possible anymore to talk about the kind of things that I was interested in talking about.
This is what, 2015, 16?
Yeah, so I went to do my PhD in the States. So in America, you do PhDs in 2 sections. So they have a taught section, which is kind of more like a British Masters, and then there's a dissertation section, which is more like our PhD. So when I was in the States, when I was actually there doing the taught section, that was before everything had gone completely bonkers. They hadn't decided I was a Nazi at that point. By the time I finished the actual dissertation, 2015, the whole kind of gender conflict had really taken off. So by the time I finished, I mean, when I'd started in 2007, they'd said to me, by the time you finish this, the subject of your research will have made you a thought criminal. I might have taken a different view on it. I probably wouldn't, but so kind of by the time I finished, I had to kind of confront the fact that if I did want to try and get an academic job, I wouldn't be able to work on the kind of things that I wanted to work on.
So in brief, what did you want to work on, and how have you managed to, or how far have you managed to pursue that?
What I'm particularly interested in is the relationship between sex-based exploitation and the thing we used to call gender, or that feminists used to call gender, so the social mechanisms which perpetuate sex-based oppression. So I was particularly interested in looking at rape as a kind of axiomatic kind of example of male dominance, and then trying to work out how patriarchal masculinity reproduces the structures of male violence and the exploitation of women's bodies, basically. And the kind of using women's bodies as a resource, basically. Because I think one of the ways of thinking about what patriarchy is it's a structure that converts women into resources. And I'm very interested about how the materiality of women's bodies and the culture comes together to produce that.
Well, ultimately, you get a situation like Andrew Tate, don't you?
Right.
Commodifying women in a very literal sense. Thank you. We'll talk more about these issues shortly. Tonia, you've been Labour MP since 2017, and you're back. But there are kind of two separate issues, and they're kind of connected. And one is the issue of women in sport, because you've been a professional rugby player, is that right?
But I wouldn't go as far as saying professional, but yeah. I have got a few caps for Wales from back in the 90s, so yeah,
Okay.
very proud of it.
Yeah. I was thinking, you know, we've only recently seen a proper recognition of professional women's football in this country. And I was watching the film Copa 71, I don't know if you've seen it, it's wonderful, about the first Women's World Cup, which revealed how much had been suppressed for so long. And I wonder what you make of what progress has been like. We all know the last few years have been quite complicated because of issues around trans people in sport. Where are we now?
I think politically we're in a better place in the United Kingdom, but it's been a battle, and there's been a large group of us fighting to ensure that men do not play in women's sport. And I feel very strongly about that. But this began a long time ago, and it's been a gradual thing. And we've seen over the last 14 years of a Tory government, regardless of your politics, that this has just slid into normality because of lobbying and because of reports that were done by the Women and Equalities Committee in 2015-16, which some people in this room may have been part of. But we are in a place where I came into Parliament in 2016 and was lobbied by a transsexual who said to me, hang on a minute, I don't like this self-ID. I'm not happy with this Maria Miller. What is this report? And I kind of went, yeah, whatever. Kind of, let's look into this. And you start picking away and you realise that the normalisation of men coming into women's spaces was happening. And it was actually, I feel for transsexual people and people that wish to live their lives with a gender recognition certificate being bombarded. And, please don't take this the wrong way, because I know we're here, and actually that movement that's happened because of Stonewall has put us into a place where the mantra of trans women are women has become a normalised statement, and it's not. So I'm so pleased. Going back to sport, because I've gone off on a random tangent, because that was what was happening. And the fact that I remember going to Pride in 2019 and everybody going, trans women and women, have been really angry about it. And I was going, hang on a minute, why is this happening? Because I've just got this theory. Well, how does that work then? Because it doesn't. Because it doesn't work. And, it doesn't matter what you do to your body, you're never going to be a woman. You can live as a woman. You can change your gender. There's a law that allows you to do it, but you'll never be me. And I got really angry about it. Sorry if I'm rambling, but there is a point to my story. And the fact is, when I was at home and I'd been lobbied by Labour Women's Declaration because I had members in the party, so thank you very much, Kerry, and everybody that's part of Labour Women's Declaration. And we were having these conversations, and this was a conversation I was relaying to them about my personal experience. And then they said, but, is it happening? And then I kind of went and lobbied Welsh Government and said, hang on a minute, are there any men playing women's sport in Wales? Hang on, there was a transgender rugby player who folded people like deck chairs, right? And then I found out that I had a meeting with Sport Wales. And they said, well, actually, we've assisted somebody in transitioning. And I kind of went, yes, that's lovely. That's really nice of you to put them on their journey, but surely they're not going to be playing their sport as a woman. And they kind of went, tumbleweed. And then a little bit later, when I came back to Parliament and we were all there, then there was this little group of people that just went, shit, it's happening. And I went, no, it's not, no, don't be daft. And it was. And we saw that it was happening, and somebody was aiming to be in the Commonwealth Games, and it was all lined up. And if it wasn't for the coalition of Sharon Davis, of somebody that I don't want to mention because I don't want to put them in that domain, and others, it really really did. And, you know, fair play for women, so Nicola and also Emma, and Fiona. Absolutely brilliant people that I worked with in order to just ask that question in the House of Commons. Because we have to keep asking, how does that work then? What does that mean for women? And so I've seen it. It is terrible. It has happened, but I think we're in a better place. So I'm really, my glass is half full of water, not wine, as it usually is. But I genuinely believe that it's still a battle, but we're in a better place than we were 5 years ago.
Thank you. I want to talk about politics more broadly with the whole panel, including yourself, but I wanted to ask Victoria next. Your book, which I found really interesting, well, Susanna's book documents intergenerational battles through the history of British feminism, the young turning against the old. And I thought that was an interesting thread through your book as well. Tell me why you wrote it. You know, is it just about young people turning against older people, or is there something else going on with women and how older women are regarded? Well, treated, I should say.
I think sort of when I started writing it, I think one of the things that motivated me was because I'd come from a background of being kind of quite 1990s liberal feminist, kind of third wave, kicking back against the second, you know, all those kind of, I mean, there are a lot of stereotypes, but exactly the kind of thing that Natasha Walter and Ariel Levy would come to criticise in like Female Chauvinist Pigs. But I had quite strong ideas because we weren't, well, I certainly think I wasn't taught a lot about feminist history. I kind of had this, what I see now as very patronising ideas, kind of, the second wave and the first wave, you know, they did some great stuff, they got some nice laws, but they were bigots, weren't they? And they were they didn't like sex, they didn't like porn, and, you know, real caricatures. And it was almost this idea that women who'd come before us had laid the groundwork by enabling us to vote and get an education and go to work. But we were the ones who had really come to fruition as full human beings almost, and kind of be sexual beings, be free and not be constrained by gender. And some of that, I think, was related to the body as well, this idea that if you're going to be free, you don't want to be tied to femaleness too much. And I think a lot of that is really coming to bite us now. I think a lot of us didn't really understand why the body matters so much, because it is so often used against us and used as an argument for why we must be limited. And I think, that was kind of the background I had. And then as I'd got older and my body had changed, I'd had children, I was approaching menopause, and my opinions about feminism, particularly, you know, they started to change, and I started to ask questions about this. And then I started to think, hang on, lots of people see me the way that I saw second wave feminists. And God, that's a bit of a swizz, isn't it? You know, it's just, I didn't think that'd happen. You know, it was that leopards eating people's faces party thing. Like, I didn't think that. But, and then I kind of, and it made me think more about, you know, we have this idea of older women as kind of conservative forces, as like past it all, and when actually a lot of maybe different opinions, they're not to do with cohort, they're to do with life stages, and actually quite a lot happens to you over your lifetime that is related to the body if you're female, and it gives you knowledge and it gives you an understanding. And also sometimes when you're older as well, I felt I'm in a position to think things and say things that I wasn't. You know, when I was, you know, in the 90s, that kind of lad culture, being at university then, I kind of, there were a lot of things that I excused or made arguments to justify and told myself were empowering, because actually what the alternative would have been complete panic. You know, you need to, whereas I felt more liberated to be able to think it. And then you know, and then as I wrote the book, I began to think more and more about how this idea of kind of we don't necessarily look up to older women, or we're kind of taught this. We're taught to fear our older selves. You know, we live in this culture that fears older women. You know, there's so much more stuff directed at fixing the bodies of older women compared to older men, and so many treatments, and it's. so much of this fear of the body, I think you can connect it to this flight from the body that we're seeing in quite a lot of younger people. But I can also think it's connected to just dividing women up and stopping them feeling bonds across generations. And then I think that links as well just historically not telling women about women of the past and making us think that they were completely other, that until we came along, women just hadn't got the imagination to be any different, when actually they were really constrained. And I think one of the things that really I found myself thinking about a lot when I was reading Susanna's book was just, I felt that so much of the feminism that I'd started reading when I was, that looked at the past, was often so critical of earlier feminists in a kind of, oh, we're better now kind of thing. You know, this, when actually a lot of them were dealing with so many compromises and so many different pressures, and obviously a lot of them had different ideas about how to face these pressures. But one thing I just kept thinking was, men could have just given them this stuff at any point. Women have always women have always made the case for their full humanity, and we shouldn't feel ashamed and so critical.
Yeah, I know it seems like a trivial example, but you know, like when the Garrett Club finally decided to vote to let women in, and so now you vote to let us in.
Yeah, they could have at any point, and this idea that it's because, oh, you didn't say. No, women have been saying since forever.
Right, let's take some questions that are for everybody. The first is something that Victoria's just raised, which is I'm struck by how often pioneering women who are pushing feminist causes are forgotten or not remembered by history books, then they're rediscovered. And I'm wondering why this is and how far that's changing. I don't know if you want to take that one first, Susanna. You know, we're finding it out with aspects of sport, we're finding it out with, medical pioneers in all kinds of spheres.
So I don't think that this is unique to feminism. I mean, I think there's loads of history, and it's hard to know all of it. But I think there are obviously some sort of totemic figures, like Mary Wollstonecraft is a good example. But I think there also are. I mean, I think Eleanor Rathbone, who I mentioned earlier, is a really hugely significant figure. And I think there are various reasons why she's not better known, one of which is that she was an independent MP, so there isn't a political party that has a kind of interest in holding her up as an icon in the way that Barbara Castle is a sort of icon for Labour, and Nancy Astor is an icon, and Margaret Thatcher for the Conservatives. Although having said that, there are also I think that Labour has possibly paid more attention to its female pioneers than the Conservative Party. There are some quite interesting early Conservative MPs, a woman called Mavis Tate, and others whose name escaped me, but who I had never heard of. No one ever seems to have written their biographies. One of the things that I'll stop in just one second, but there are no spaces in London that are kind of historically connected with the history of feminism in London. When I thought about where to have a book launch, there's no house, for example. Nancy Astor's house isn't a museum. There are several house museums that were sort of houses of famous men, Dickens, Keats, Leighton, etc. But when you sort of think, where's a feminist space, you sort of come up a bit short. There are some women's centres and so on from the second wave, and obviously existing organisations, Women's Aid and so on. But it's as if there isn't much of a sort of physical imprint. And I don't know how much, obviously the Carolyn Criado Perez campaign to have the Millicent Fawcett statue, people can think sort of statues don't mean all that much, and sort of everyone's got a bit bored of sort of statue discourse, knock them down, put them up, etc. But nonetheless, there was something important about that, I think, about just sort of putting her there.
And can I just, by contrast, say, that memorial they put up on Whitehall to women in war, which is a load of empty uniforms hanging on a peg, I thought, really? In a way, it's the same thing. It's like you couldn't give us a proper thing. Anyway, recognise individual women. Right, who wants to go next on this? So the idea that we are still rediscovering feminists.
I think it's also connected to what Victoria wrote about in Hags. There's like a constant breaking of generational connections between women. So it's like we're reinventing the wheel over and over and over again. And I think that's what's very interesting about Susanna's book. Can you hear me? Sorry. And I'm really, really glad that you went back all the way to Wollstonecraft, because that period and the late 18th century and the early 19th century is really fascinating, I think, because it's like these are the same questions, it's the same set of questions, like the fraught relationship with the labour movement, like equality versus difference, like, you know, how we reconcile sex and class and like imperialism, and a very similar set of issues. And we don't know this. Even those of us that do this professionally or have trained in it don't know that the history of that goes back 200 years and it's the same set of issues, because we're not taught our own history.
And some of it is just destroyed. I mean, I was thinking about the painter Pauline Boty, who was contemporary of Peter Blake's, died very young of cancer, and they found a load of her canvases stacked in a shed. And I think it was her brother and her dad had just left them in a farmhouse. Thank God they were eventually rescued. Ali Smith's novel, Autumn, I think was about it. Sally, what are your thoughts about this?
Yes, I knew Pauline Boty, and she was a very remarkable woman. I think that every generation has to relearn its history and feminism is not popular. It's not an issue that's it's divisive, it's argumentative, it's like a lot of radical political movements. It goes into the darkest far reaches of our lives, which is what Susanna's book shows you. You know, poverty, reproductive sexuality, pornography, sexploitation in every meaning of that word. It goes into some of the most difficult, but it also goes into some of the most glorious parts of our lives. And I just think every generation, I've watched 2 generations grow up, and I've taught them to adulthood and to adult maturity. And yeah, they can't know everything all at once, and they do have to find their own way through these issues. And conditions change. I just think that each generation reinvents feminism anew, really.
I want to just add another question. I'm going to start with Tonia on this, which is, and it's something that Pragna raised, which is the role of the relationship between feminism and left-wing politics, which I think it's fair to say right now is quite fraught. But there's always been this tension, I sense from Susanna's book, about how trades unions, I mean, they opposed the 4 Dagenham women. And I just wonder if you want to go first, Tonia, on just as a Labour MP.
Can I just say
Go on, Sally.
Just because it's already come up, I mean, family allowances and equal pay were opposed by the Labour movement for 100 years. I love the Labour movement. I've written about it. It's wonderful. They opposed family allowances and equal pay.
That's right. Again, it's documented beautifully in the book. Tonia. It's all right. You've got 5 years ahead of you. Don't worry.
The problem is, I know that this is being filmed. If I didn't, I think we're in a problematic place with the trade unions. I believe there is a movement. Well, I don't believe. I know that there is a movement which, and it comes from a place of privilege, to be honest with you. And I feel very strongly about this. So I'm going to go off on another tangent. So I do apologise. When you're in politics, you're in a very privileged position, and you can make decisions about what you think are best for people's lives without actually having reflected on what people's lives are actually like. And I always say to people that the most, you know, I go, ooh, you know, my life was really hard. I was divorced. I was a single mother. I only got into politics because my mother was able to take my child to look after my son until he went to university. And I think to myself, oh, you know, if it wasn't for the power of women, I wouldn't be where I am today, and I'm very privileged. But I realise that privilege when I have gone to see the prostitutes in High Street in Swansea, to give them Christmas presents, to sit and to have a conversation with them, to see them be in the same age as me and have no teeth and there being their pimps waiting outside, waiting for them to come out, for them to go to work to get their next hit. That makes you realise about your privilege as a woman. It doesn't matter, I'm not going to use them anyway, but thank you, Luella. But, you know, and that makes you realise about your privilege. And unfortunately, in politics, unless you got into it in a particular way, which was, shit, that 6 weeks later, my whole life has changed, and you realise and appreciate what you've got, then I think we're in a... There are people that are in political movements that live in very privileged bubbles that don't actually realise where they're coming from, and they actually have infiltrated our trade union movement, and I feel really strongly about it. And those that do realise that sex-based rights are important, actually are too afraid to speak up, because somebody's wearing a lanyard, or somebody's wearing a badge, or somebody's waving a flag, and sadly, that isn't reflective of our politics and isn't the reality. They're living in a particular bubble that isn't what is happening on the ground. And I really feel upset that they're not seeing what I see, or what I have to force myself out of my privileged position to go to see. Because unless you think you were in a bad position, but until you go knock on that door, until you go meet those people, unless you have that contact through work, and you are in that position where we are very privileged, and we have to realise that I think we are where we are politically because of our privilege, and it's only because it has permeated into our everyday lives. You know, and I would say in most of us probably here are middle class, because it's permeated into our lives now, that we're fighting and that people are actually taking notice. And I worry about it, and I'm so pleased that the CAS report is out. I am so pleased of the campaigning and the work that's been done by Sex Matters, by LWD, by the lawyers, by everybody, and I know Maya's here tonight. If people like Maya hadn't done what she'd done, and people like Alison Bailey hadn't done what they'd done, and being that brave, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in today. So, you know, really big out to them.
Thank you. Pragna, I'm going to come to you next on this. And I want to add, listening to Tonia, is, you know, something that's often talked about is how, the far right and fundamentalists are jumping on the gender rights issue because they've got their own agenda, and feminists should be wary. I just wonder, from your perspective, having begun as a campaigner, you know, back in the 70s, how the whole relationship between political wings and feminists seems to you?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that when groups like SBS and others began in the 70s, we borrowed heavily from the American Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, and the Black feminist movement there. And we began with a view of challenging sex oppression, oppression based on race, of course, and class oppression from a socialist feminist position. And we should not lose sight of this. This is what we've lost sight of. Now, what we're talking about when we're talking about left politics and the relationship between left and feminism is that we've moved away from this kind of anchoring in the material realities of women's lives and we've reduced our politics to identity, right? And it's become performative, you know? We are feminists, but the question is, what are our values? We are anti-racist, but the question is, what are our values? We are the left, but what are our values? And I think that a lot of the dangers I see is that identity politics has infected every social justice movement. Every social justice movement.
Tell us about the Sikh court, because that's part of it.
So, including feminist movement, one of the things from where I'm sitting, which is as a black feminist working with minority women who are challenging patriarchy on the ground, who are challenging violence against women, who are challenging, sexual violence, coercive control, child abuse, and all these things up against patriarchal structures. We talk a lot about state failings, we don't talk enough about community failings and patriarchal failings in our communities. And what we have is, because we vacated the space where the left should be, we've allowed right-wing forces to enter and infiltrate and take over. And one of so when we talk about how do we look at this? How do we position ourselves as feminists? We've got to join these dots. We've got to talk about the welfare state, the shrinking of the welfare state. We've got to talk about the assault on democratic rights. We've got to talk about the rise of the far right and racism and populist nationalism. And we've got to talk about the rise of religious fundamentalisms, because they are filling that vacuum. And they are also infiltrating social justice movements and subverting the ethos and the values of those movements and preventing solidarity from forming. And for me, the question for feminists is, how do we position ourselves? How do we rebuild ourselves and move from a position of identity politics to a position of solidarity politics? That is the question before us.
Okay. Susanna, do you want to give your thoughts on this, as having written a whole history of this?
I just want to say something really brief, which is that just echoing what Pragna said, is that some of these feminist causes I think are really humanitarian causes. I mean, I absolutely think that about pornography, for example. I mean, I think there are really sort of humanitarian reasons to oppose what's going on with kind of commercialization of sex, as well as feminist reasons. And it just, Virginia Woolf, in her most angry feminist book, 3 Guineas, is the book in which she also sort of says she hates the word feminism, and there's this kind of little skit where she imagines herself writing it on a piece of paper and setting fire to it. Which I think, because her vision is a kind of internationalist humanitarian one, so there is a sense in which, and I think that's a kind of attack on feminism as a kind of identity politics in a way, and wanting to move beyond that. And there is always that tension in the early 20th century between the kind of internationalists, socialists, humanists, Winifred Holtby is another example, and then the feminists. And so it is complicated, I think, to sort of fight for women's politics, but within a context, and be confident about building alliances and coalitions, and not being sort of separatist all the time, although obviously holding on to the importance of being allowed to organise autonomously.
Yeah. Victoria, I don't know what you want to say on this, but I'm quite interested. Well, I thought Hags gave a sense of women who said things, who spoke out about issues like being gender critical, were being kind of called, I mean, someone said already, been called Nazis, or assumed to be right-wing. And it's funny, I was reading Right-Wing Women by Andrea Dworkin, which was written in 1980, and she identified why a lot of women who wanted to protect their rights were put off by left-wing politics. I wonder, in writing a book that was focused on the demonization of middle-aged women, whether you felt there was a kind of political divide in how it was, who was demonizing who.
Well, I think this kind of idea that women who recognise that the sex body is politically salient and it matters, are all right-wing. I mean, I think it's kind of ludicrous, and there is this, I think many of us have seen this kind of attempt to sort of suggest, until about 200 years ago, nobody knew about male and female bodies, and it was an invention of, and there is a kind of rewriting of history there. But I think at the same time, people are very receptive to this, because I think this kind of flight from the body and this fear that if you focus too much on femaleness, it's conservative and it will rein you in, is also kind of linked to a kind of fear of dependency that I think that the left needs to kind of get over that, really, because there is this kind of focus too much on individualism and authenticity and being your true self, and this failure to recognise that actually we are all shaped by each other all the time, and that needs to be kind of a fundamental of leftist politics, the fact that we're all dependent on each other, and that nobody has total freedom, and everyone needs to give and take. And I think I do feel that kind of anxiety over. I feel like the anxiety over the body is also connected to anxiety over care, and anxiety over being penned in, and anxiety over being dragged into this kind of drudgy maternal role that maybe you've been told that you're too much for special individual to actually, you want to be your true self, you want to be liberal. But actually, we just need to all sort of recognise that and recognise that we're all hemmed into. Yes.
Right, I've got one last question before we open it up to audience questions, which is, it feels like the whole row around gender critical issues has put a certain amount of energy into British feminism, certainly changed British feminism. And I wonder what all your thoughts are on what are the big issues now and how far you feel optimistic or not. Who wants to go first? Sally, start with you.
Well, I would like to say something about the former question, if you don't mind,
Please
which
do.
is that 200 years ago, the feminists knew that what the difference was between women and men, and that was the capacity to bear children. And it's the bearing of children that rendered women poor and dependent and unable to find employment except that which was paid half or less of that of a man. And I think I'm the last generation, I'm 80 years old, I was born in 1943, to grow up with the fear of getting pregnant. And I think the jury is out now as to how much the pill, IVF, same-sex marriages or cohabitations, adoption, all the legal changes which began in the 1960s and which Harriet Harman and the New Labour Women Caucus pushed through in the 1990s and 2000s. I don't know how much that has changed the psyche of young women, but it was certainly the case that and certainly feminists of my generation, the women's liberation movement, we argued all the time about what was a woman, what made her different from a man. And we came down to reproductive, that she had a womb, she had the capacity to bear children, and then, but I don't know, that seems to have been forgotten for the technological
the fear
and medical
and the
reasons.
stigma that went with unwanted pregnancy and sexual assault and so
also
on.
your life was radically transformed if you got pregnant. I went, anyway. It's not like that anymore.
No, I will say, I think
And
it's the same
that's
for
the
divorce
difference.
too. I think
Yes.
my generation, I'm in my 50s, I think we took it for granted. But, I think about what a stigma it was for my mother's generation to be divorced. And all these things that to some extent, we've taken for granted. I think most of us are in our 50s or older. And we have so much to owe to the sisters and the mothers who went before us, don't we?
Well, I just think it's important to remember that it wasn't that women didn't know about sexual difference 200 years ago. They knew only too well. And Virginia Woolf wrote about it so beautifully. And that's one of the stories that you're telling in the book.
Yeah. She's a complicated woman, Virginia Woolf, as many people are in these issues. Tonia, what are your thoughts about the big issues that lie ahead and how far you feel optimistic about where British feminism might be going next?
Well, I am positive about the future, and just even having a conversation with the wonderful Rachel Cashman just before we came on stage, I think we have to be positive. We do now have a Labour government. I want you to believe and know that there are many, many people in there. There are some that agree and some that disagree, but those women and men that haven't spoken out are doing a sterling job behind the scenes. and get into the places where other voices may not reach. And I have to say that because many people, and we do have Rosie Duffield that's, you know, lived everything out on Twitter. And has experienced a very sharp, you know, and a lot of abuse because of that on Twitter. But we have, are you there, Rosie? Hiya! Yeah, she's at the back of the room. But the real world is not on Twitter. And I have to say, while we play out this fight on Twitter, there are very important conversations, very important people in this room that need to be having those conversations with the right people. The party is moving into the right place. The Cass report, everything that we do now in government has to be Cass compliant. Any belittling of the work that Hilary Cass has done is just not going to happen. It is just not going to happen on my watch and on the other Labour women's watch. It's not going to happen.
How many of you are there? How many Labour women MPs are there now? Do you know?
Well, I've sent off many letters of the new intake, so I'm waiting for them to get in touch. I believe there's got to be about 30 of us at least that are bold enough to say.
Right.
But we've got a number of women in. But this is my question, and it might come up, right? But what do you expect somebody to do? If it's to be bold on Twitter, it's not the place to be. It's not the place to hang yourself and your career out to dry. No. But they are bold in the fact that they are having those conversations. I had a conversation with Wes Streeting, and he was like, he's been incredible. He is a man that has been on a journey and has seen why all these really strong women, Rosie, myself included, and others, well, why were you banging on about this stuff, love? You know? And he gets it, and he's in a responsible place. And why would you want to take the word woman out of any document that is related to anything, let alone health? Why take the word woman out of it? And it's as simple as that. Ask why. And then you understand, and he's been, don't worry, Hilary, Harriet.
Briefly, Tonia,
don't worry. And I just think that the world is waking up. The Labour Party has woken up. We still have work to do. Okay. Only when Julie Bindel said she was going to hold her nose and vote Labour, how fantastic is that? Because we have to believe we are going to be in the right place. And when you ask how optimistic I am really optimistic, because if I'm not optimistic, I'm getting out of politics and I'm going to move somewhere where I can just hide in a hole,
Tonia,
because I can't do it any other way.
Thank you, Tonia. I'm going to come to Victoria next.
Well, I think, so if anyone sees me ranting on Twitter, they'll see that I'm not always very optimistic. But I think, I feel that what has happened over the past 10 years has been so mad. It has kind of awakened a lot of women to a kind of real feminism that, whereas I think, I don't know, I feel like prior to that, a lot of us, certainly I was kind of coasting along and, thinking, obviously, I'm support abortion rights and I'm against male violence, but not having actually a structural analysis but actually we've been pushed into a corner, and when you have your words taken away from you and you think, actually, I can't explain why that works like that anymore, you actually start to see it a lot more. I mean, one thing I worry about a lot now is just how pornography has just infiltrated so many people's idea of what a woman is and what a woman should be like, and how we untangle that. There are so many things that have got so deeply embedded, but I just think there are so many women who've woken up to it, and a lot has changed over the past 5 years in terms of how we're talking about it. And I also feel like the younger generation, the younger generation, but I do feel, compared to sort of when I was sort of struggling with the kind of raunch environment of the sort of 90s, early noughties, I think it's reached a point, with Pornhub and that I think younger women just can't be in denial about it, you know, and that's a bad thing, but it's also a good thing that I think there is a lot more direct criticism of the culture.
Can I just do topical reference, but Taylor Swift has weaponized her mass following to tackle deep fake porns, because there's been a lot of that circulating with her image.
Yes.
She does seem to be using her power for good. That's as far as I'll go, as giving an opinion. Jane?
I've been fighting. Me and Victoria ended up in the gender war together in like 2012, 2013 when we first ran into the TRAs, and we're like, these people are saying really bonkers things. And if people do the really bonkers things, that's going to be really bad. And that was like, so like 12 years ago. So I would really quite like this to be over soon.
Are we at the end of the beginning of the end, do you think? Or are we still in the middle?
I don't know. It's felt like we're at the beginning of the end for quite a long time now. That's the bit I'm worried about. I keep being like, no, that's it. It's like you're playing Jenga and you keep taking out a brick and it like wobbles. And then you're like, oh, okay, another one. And it wobbles. And we're just like...
You are or aren't optimistic?
I think we will win the gender war insofar as I think we will get a clarification in law that protects women's single-sex spaces. What I'm really worried about and what I want to start thinking about is how we get our women's services uncaptured. That's what I'm really concerned about now. Like I said, I did my PhD on rape. Most feminist women have a particular area that is there. I'm particularly concerned about rape crisis services. I am profoundly upset that women suffering from sexual trauma cannot get female-only services in this country, and I want us to start setting our mind to what we actually need to do in order to get our services back, because we built those services and we need them.
Thank you. Pragna, your thoughts on this? And it does seem to be, from what Jane's been saying, it feels like we're having to refight battles that even our feminist great-great-grandmothers didn't have to fight.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a mixed bag in terms of, I am optimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic is because I think there are amazing struggles going on. If we're going to win the ideology battle, I think it's because women are pushing back. Feminists are pushing back. Feminists are struggling against what I consider to be a reinvention of patriarchy. Yep. I think there are pockets, there are amazing struggles going on at the grassroots level, not just against the trans ideology and the lack of women-only space, or the shutting down of women-only spaces, but against all sorts of other things. For example, the anti-immigration, onslaught. I think that's, for me, one of the biggest issues as feminists we should be thinking about. It is European-wide, it is global. There is not a single ocean, sea that has not got dead bodies lying at the bottom, And it makes us hard to live as human beings when the land is just full of people who are othered and people who are persecuted and people who are scapegoated. So for me, there is a wider problem going on globally, which is 1, anti-immigration, 2, far-right populism and nationalism, and 3, religious fundamentalism. Yeah. These are the key struggles, and I think the sooner feminism anchors itself within a kind of, for me, I'm a socialist, so I'm going to say it, within a socialist and democratic framework of rights, better, because we will not win this through identity politics. We will not win it by competing with each other for resources and for a race to the bottom as who's the ultimate victim in all of this. We have to come together and find a way of talking across difference, but also find a way of reclaiming the soul of feminism and our humanity in the process, and this idea that, we have more in common than we have differences.
Excellent. I want to take some questions as well. Susanna, do you want to tell us if you're optimistic?
So just really briefly, I don't know if anybody's read Fintan O'Toole's book, Heroic Failure, which was about the Brexit vote. And at the very end of that book, so he's obviously describing the kind of version of sort of Englishness, the kind of myth, which he thinks led to Brexit, basically. And at the end of that book, he sort of says, but isn't there another sort of Englishness? And he mentions Blake, and he mentions Stuart Hall. And he's obviously there are other versions. He's trying to sort of sketch out a radical tradition. And I suppose the point when I read that book was at the point when this grassroots feminist movement was kind of blowing my mind. And I sort of thought, I guess I don't know whether there's any connection between Brexit and the revival of grassroots feminism in Britain, but I think it's an interesting question. Obviously there's always been connections between feminists here, feminists in Europe, feminists in America, feminists in the former colonies as well. You know, there's a big sort of complicated and interesting relationship between the sort of independence and anti-colonial movements and feminism in Britain. So it's not to try and be sort of parochial about it, sort of Ireland's story of feminism, but at the same time, I sort of think there is a really rich and interesting tradition here, and I love it. And the sort of movement that has grown up here, and we are the sort of global HQ of sex-based rights, is absolutely brilliant. So,
thank you. Right, we've got time for some questions. Can I ask people to keep the questions nice and concise so we can get answers? And if you want to direct it to a particular member of the panel, do. So we're going to pass over, not one of those, one of the remote ones. Have we got one? You still got one there, right? Okay, right. So if we take one each side. Right, let's start at the very front row, and then do you want to go to the lady on the end of that row with the glasses? Right, thank you. Hello.
Hi, it was wonderful to hear you all speak, and it's great to be here. I wanted to ask you, June Jordan said, we have to be the change we want to see happen. I wanted to ask you individually what you thought that change was in your eyes that we could take away with us.
Thank you. All right. Brief answers from anyone who wants. Do you want to take that first? Pragna?
I don't know. I haven't got a vision of what that final destination looks like. All I know is that there's a struggle to get there, and all I know is that it's a multi-directional struggle to get there. We have to challenge the racism, the patriarchy, the classism, all of these things at the same time without creating a hierarchy of struggle.
Fantastic. Can I keep it there then, if that's your, because that is a kind of consistent point you've made. Who wants to take it on this side? Tonia.
I've got a brief answer. We're going to have to keep fighting the sausage club, so keep going.
Jane, do you want to go? Only if you want. Whoever wants.
I think women need to really deeply feel and understand and believe that their humanity and their femaleness are not in conflict.
Okay. Victoria.
Well, I agree with all of those answers there, but I kind of... I don't know what to add.
No, that's fine. Sorry. Sally, did you want to add anything on this issue? No, that's fine. Right, let's take our next question then. Hello.
Hi.
Is that Maya?
Maya, hello.
Hello.
Force it, society. Win it back, let it die, kill it, or something else.
Right, who wants to take this? Yeah, go on, Susanna.
So I think there obviously needs to be some work done to sort of develop a feminist policy platform now that we've got a Labour government. So obviously part of that can happen in government, but civil society is really vital as well. And obviously at the moment, as you know, there's a complete sort of fracture between the new sort of grassroots movement and Force It, which has obviously been around for a lot longer. I mean, I sort of think, it was interesting I was looking at all the different manifestos this morning, and trying to, because obviously there's, all these organisations put out manifestos, and so did the women's groups. And one of the things that comes up in the Mums Net one and in the WP UK one, and obviously Sex Matters, it's an issue as well, is about the clarification in the Equality Act, which obviously Force It is sort of not talking about at all. But And then there's obviously a huge range of other issues, and there is some where Fawcett would overlap with, other groups. So I guess I just think it can't hold this sort of like not talking to each other. So I sort of think that there's going to have to be some kind of attempt to sort of have a conversation, because it's just ridiculous. You can't have the kind of longest established, best known, especially with Harriet Harman as the chair, kind of saying we're going to do this and just ignoring the sort of rabble. I sort of hope that now it's in government and that will become more possible, but goodness knows.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a couple more questions. Can we take, let's take the person in the second row here, hello. And then can we go further back? Sorry, I feel bad now. You give me a sad face. Okay, no, the lady with the sad face, sorry, my feminine emotions have been easily manipulated by you. No, sorry, just the other side of the pillar. Just the other side of the pillar here. No, you're going to have to ask it now. Right, sorry. We'll come further back next. Right, yes, hello.
Hi, I'd just like to say thank you. Hope is the only thing we can really have in our hearts. We've got to have hope. We've got to fight. Victoria, what you said about people coming to their belief system in their lifestyle, it wasn't their lifestyle, their life chances. There's 3 generations of women come after me, and if I don't hope with them, for their future, I am really letting them down. We have to hope. None of them agree with me at the moment. They've all gone their separate ways, and they're very voice conscious, very able to speak it, but they haven't reached the points that make them change their minds, and I know they will, and I'm never going to say, I told you so, but believe in them.
Thank you. Right.
Thanks, Samira. So my question is about the word gender and how it's been weaponized within feminism. And I'm really surprised to hear Susanna say that decades ago, feminists wanted to use the word gender because they didn't want to use the word sex. And Jane's given us a really good definition of it. But my issue is that I can never get a definition today of what it means. And I just wonder whether there's a kind of, answer from the panel about how the word gender has completely and utterly undercut feminism, because nobody will actually say what it means if you ask them.
The UN talks about gender-based violence now, doesn't it?
Yeah, what does it mean by gender-based violence?
Yeah. So am I right in thinking that it used to be used, instead of the word sex, or the word sex added too much like sex for some organisations, and now it's become a social construct?
Well,
sorry.
We've
got so many experts on this panel.
In second wave feminism, it was the concept of gender already existed because it's there in Wollstonecraft, actually. Women aren't educated, and therefore they're not able to fulfill their potential in society. That is the concept that then later becomes gender, right? The socialization of women for a particular social role inside a patriarchal society. And then in the 60s and 70s, it's taken from sexology, where it is a more kind of internal psychological concept that's developed in relationship to working with intersex kids, and then it's applied to the sociological dimensions of sex in feminism. But that's what happens in second wave feminism. And then in third wave feminism, it just starts to mean inner feels, or like how one identifies with conventions of masculinity or femininity.
Anyone else want to take this, or shall I move on? Right. Hands up. Right. Where are the microphones at the moment, please? Right. Can we go further back? Let's take the furthest back question, which is the young person with the hand there. And then I'll take the person on the end of the row here. Thank you. Want to take this one first? Hello.
Hi. So firstly, I want to say that young women are waking up, and we stand with all the generations of feminist women in this room today. I'm so happy to be here. So my question is about the relationship between male violence and the left, which Pragna Patel has written about extensively, mainly about the anti-racist movement. And from personal experience, I've seen groups like Sisters Uncut, which claimed to run the Reclaim the Night marches after Sarah Everard. They were defending a convicted torturer, Sarah Jane Barker. So how can we explain the problem of male violence within the left, and how has the recent issue of sex and gender changed things?
Thank you. So how do we explain the issue of sex and violence? In a sense, to a younger generation is sort of implicit in your question, isn't it? It's not as if the younger generation aren't experiencing sexual violence. I mean, you know, what's so terrible is I remember a GP talking about the number of young women coming with terrible injuries, particularly from, you know, anal sex, and that she was having to explain to them, you don't have to do this. I don't know if you want to go first on this, Victoria?
Yeah, I think sort of one thing that I found sort of in quite a few feminist books, or feminists, there are some, I almost feel like at the moment there are kind of two kinds of feminists. There's a kind of feminist discussion that tries to accommodate, it's still trying to accommodate the sex trade, still trying to not criticise pornography too much, still trying to accommodate gender identity. And I find that sort of in quite a lot of these texts and a lot of these arguments, there is a tendency to present the bad man as always right-wing, always dominant. You know, it's never the men who are right next to you. It's never the men on your side. And I think that makes it safe for women who are in that kind of environment to make those arguments. But it's also, it never holds these particular men to account. And it also, it's a way of creating a narrative of sexual violence which doesn't actually address sex. It just addresses all these other elements of privilege, but actually the fact that even the most left-wing man is still male. It's never addressed. And I think that is a real problem in that kind of writing. It's almost like there's a kind of we can get around not being allowed to criticize all these different things by just making out it's all about Andrew Tate, but it's not all about Andrew Tate. There are lots of ways in which it's just one of these things that kind of the second wave, I think, were very good at pointing out that violence is in all sorts of homes, all sorts of environments. It's masked, it's hidden. Every particular group has a thing that it's happening over there. It's in that group. It's not in our group. We're not like that. But actually, it's everywhere. And I think we need to kind of find spaces where women can talk about that freely.
I'm Jane. I know you're going to speak next. I would just say that I think the Me Too movement and some of the young women who've galvanised around it have actually started to show that it is everywhere. And I think the head of the Metropolitan Police said there's 4 million men who are sex offenders. 4 million. It's not a tiny... I mean, it's not all men, but it's a lot of men.
I mean, I think this is one of the things that really... One of the reasons why I felt obliged to kind of stand up in relationship to the issue with the gender war, because I think what young women really need is you need a materialist sex class analysis, right? You need to understand that all male people have an investment in the exploitation of women's bodies and labour, and it doesn't matter whether they're left-wing men or right-wing men, right? And that thing that you're talking about, that mechanism where left-wing men are like, or left-wing people are like, oh, it's all the right-wing men who are oppressing women, and the populists are like, oh, it's the brown men who are oppressing women, or oh, it's the men in dresses who are oppressing women. And there's all these different groups of men who want to point at another group of men and say they are the men who are oppressing women, and we are the ones who will protect you from the bad men. And it's like, no, it's all of you. It's all of you. Like, stop playing this game. And the only analysis that will tell women that truth is a materialist sex class analysis. They all have an interest in exploiting you. And they will play whatever games to gaslight you into thinking that it's the other men who are bad. And left-wing men are particularly annoying because they claim to believe in justice, but they don't care about justice when they want someone to make their sandwiches and sexually service them.
Not all left-wing men. Who had the microphone? Yes, I'm afraid this will probably have to be our last question, but thank you.
It's been a brilliant panel, and I really like what's coming out about hope. I think it was you, Victoria, who talked about how very few people went to university. Was it 6%? So academic feminism just wasn't a thing. I've taught in a university for nearly 30 years now. UCU, University and College Union, voted, well, didn't vote for the case, it condemned the Cass report last month. So yes, I'm delighted to hear hope, but I'm really dispirited. You know, I've taught, 1.5 generations or so. Most of my students are women. I'm in the humanities. And
do you have a question?
The question is,
thank you.
what do we do about that, really?
Yeah.
Well,
about the academic world. No, thank you. That's a really good point.
And I'm in it. You know, but I'm not of it, or the other way around.
Thank you for sharing that with us. It is a real issue, isn't it? The status of the academic world and the situation for feminists within it. Who wants to take this one first? Victoria.
Laura.
Thank you for your question.
I think Laura Favaro has written quite a lot about that, because I think, she was the academic who was commissioned to research the gender wars in academia, but then got completely ostracised because she came out with the wrong results. But what she actually found was that a lot of gender identitarian academics thought they were being really victimised, but actually they were bullying women who did speak out. But actually what she also found was there were loads and loads of people in the middle who were frightened to speak. And when they say in the middle, it was actually they agreed with the feminists, but they just didn't. And it's kind of, I think, there's this real need to tap into the fact that there are so many silent people at the moment who are thinking these things but do not feel safe to say it because they see what happens to women like Laura. And I think it's just we have to show solidarity with them.
Susanna, did you want to add on this?
I think the attack on free speech is what I find most unnerving, really. It's this sort of, this kind of Maoist kind of, wish to sort of shut down and kind of re-education. I mean, quite literally, people talk about, you need to be educated, go to some workshop or whatever, and correct your wrong thoughts. That's the bit that I find the hardest. I can sort of cope with really irreconcilable views, but this kind of illiberal sort of blanket that seems to be so oppressive in universities and in humanities particularly, which is what I studied, and I always sort of thought that was a really valuable bit of the world. And publishing also seems to be really a very, very difficult place to have any of these views.
The idea of books being hidden from view, I find remarkable.
But I don't have an easy sort of answer, except that you just have to kind of keep on pushing back. And obviously, Jo Phoenix's win against the Open University was really important. She's another one of these brave people who brought one of these cases. But it's awful about the UCU. It's shocking.
Any final thoughts? Tonia, you're the one who's in the legislative sort of driving seat, potentially, aren't you?
I just find it incredible that something like the Cass report can be rubbished when, well, everybody knows this, but I was a teacher for 20 years. Safeguarding is the priority of, and risk assessment is the first priority with the children in your care. And the fact that such a credible, fantastic report, which highlighted every single thing I was worried about, and all of us in here were, people have gone out and spent time trying to rubbish it. It is not the role of a responsible politician and responsible politicians, and the 650 of them in that place, to rubbish what Hilary Cass has done. And I'm going to, I know, but can I just, on the side of getting politicians to speak and getting people to speak, and knowing that there are many silent voices in there that agree with us, it's going to be a very slow job to give people the courage. There are many, many MPs that have turned up there and their whole lives have been turned around in 6 weeks, maybe not expecting to be there and having to learn the ropes. So it's going to be a very long road for people like myself, for Rosie and others that are in our little gang to be able to encourage them to come along. So all I can say to you is please engage with your members of parliament, share with your friends, get them to go and speak to them and say, have you spoken to this one? Have you spoken to that one? This is a long journey. We're in here for the long game. But I know that the front bench is in the right place, and we know that we will have influence across academia, and they have to come on board and have those sensible, grown-up conversations and not to silence anybody. Because I didn't go into politics I didn't grow up as the gobby woman that I am to be silenced by anybody. And that's what we need to do.
Thank you. I think gobby women is a good end note. I would like to just point out a bit of news I read recently, which is that bonobo monkeys, which are known to be the closest to humans, overthrow the patriarchy through ecstatic sex. Yeah. So thank you to Susanna for her magnificent book. Susanna's going to be signing copies of the book at the back of the room. So if you haven't bought one, or if you have bought one already, you can get more copies there. You can get them signed. And thank you to all of the panel. Good luck, Tonia, in Parliament. We'll all be watching. And Rosie and everyone else. Thank you again.